The courtroom fell silent as 10-year-old Marcus Johnson pointed at Judge Victoria Harrington. "You took me away from my real mama," he declared, voice trembling. Blood drained from the white judge's face. Security moved forward but froze when Marcus added, "Before you gave me to them." Before we dive into this shocking story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. If you're invested in stories about justice and uncovering hidden truths, hit that like button and subscribe to join our community of truth seekers. Now let's unravel how a simple juvenile hearing turned into an explosive revelation that would shake an entire city to its core. The Memphis County Juvenile Court had seen thousands of cases like this, one or so everyone thought. Marcus Johnson, a skinny 10-year-old with intelligent eyes that seemed too old for his face, stood before Judge Victoria Harrington for a shoplifting incident. It was his fifth offense in 2 years, a pattern that concerned the court but surprised no one who understood the circumstances of his life. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across his dark skin, making him appear even smaller against the imposing wood-paneled courtroom. Marcus kept his head down, shoulders hunched in the too large button-up shirt his foster parents, the Thompsons, had insisted he wear for court. The Thompsons stood slightly behind him, Gerald and Martha, an affluent white couple in their 50s who had taken in 14 foster children over the past decade. They projected an image of caring, concerned guardians with Martha, occasionally placing her hand on Marcus's shoulder in what appeared to be a comforting gesture. But Terrence Washington, the public defender assigned to Marcus's case, noticed how the boy flinched at her touch and how Gerald's smile never quite reached his eyes when discussing his foster son. "The boy needs structured discipline," Gerald had told Terrence before the hearing. "These kids from those neighborhoods, they don't understand consequences." The racial undertone wasn't subtle, but it rarely was in these cases. Judge Victoria Harrington sat elevated above them, all her reputation preceding her. At 42, she had the fastest rise to the bench in county history, known for her tough love approach that somehow always seemed tougher on minority juveniles. Her sleek blonde hair was pulled into a tight bun, her blue eyes sharp as she reviewed Marcus's file. "Another shoplifting incident, Mr. Johnson," she said, not looking up from her papers. "Stealing candy from Bennett's corner store. This pattern of behavior is concerning." Marcus remained silent, his eyes fixed on the floor. The judge continued outlining potential consequences, including mandatory counseling and possibly a short stay in juvenile detention to break this cycle of behavior. It was when she mentioned the possibility of removing him from the Thompsons for a more structured environment that something changed in Marcus's demeanor. His head snapped up, eyes suddenly focused directly on the judge's face, with an intensity that made several people in the courtroom shift uncomfortably. Judge Harrington finally looked directly at him, and that's when it happened. Marcus's arm shot up, finger pointing directly at her. "You took me away from my real mama," he said, his voice small but carrying clearly through the suddenly silent courtroom. The judge's face drained of color, her composure cracking for just a moment before she regained control. Security officers moved forward instinctively, but stopped in their tracks when Marcus continued, "Before you gave me to them." The courtroom erupted. Martha Thompson gasped audibly, clutching her chest. Gerald's face contorted with anger. "The boy is clearly disturbed," he said loudly. "This is what we've been dealing with." Judge Harrington's gavel came down with unusual force. "Court is in recess," she announced, her voice nearly breaking. 15 minutes. As she hurried from the bench, Terrence noticed her hands were shaking. Within minutes, a child services worker had appeared to escort Marcus to a separate room. The Thompsons were huddled with court officials, Gerald's voice rising occasionally with indignation. Terrence remained seated, processing what had just happened. A court clerk approached him, an older black woman named Diana, who had worked in the juvenile system for 20 years. "That boy just signed his own removal papers," she whispered. "But did you see her face?" Judge Ice Queen herself looked like she'd seen a ghost. Terrence nodded slowly. In 7 years of practicing law, he'd developed an instinct for when something wasn't right. And everything about Marcus Johnson's case suddenly felt very wrong. As the recess continued, Terrence reviewed Marcus's file again. The history was depressingly familiar. born to a single mother in South Memphis, Shanice Johnson, reportedly removed from her care at 3 years old due to unsafe living conditions and suspected neglect. Since then, he'd bounced between 4 foster homes before landing with the Thompsons 18 months ago. His behavioral issues began shortly after entering the system, a common trauma response Terrence had seen countless times. But something about the paperwork seemed off. The initial removal order was unusually vague, the documentation less thorough than standard protocol would dictate. When court resumed, Marcus was not brought back into the room. Judge Harrington, now composed but noticeably paler than before, announced that given the emotional outburst and accusations, Marcus would be temporarily placed in the care of child services, pending a psychological evaluation. The Thompsons nodded in agreement, Martha dabbing at non-existent tears. "We only want what's best for the child," Gerald stated, for the record the picture of concern. After the hearing, Terrence tried to see Marcus, but was informed he had already been transported to the County Children's Services facility. When he pressed for details about when he could meet with his client, the administrator's answers were evasive. Meanwhile, local media had already caught wind of the dramatic courtroom scene. By evening, the story was spreading, but the framing was clear. A troubled black child with a history of delinquency had made wild, unfounded accusations against a respected judge. The racist undertones were thinly veiled in the coverage, with one commentator speculating about fantasy parentage being common in children from broken homes. The next morning, Terrence received notice that a social worker named Diana Reynolds had been assigned to investigate Marcus's claim as a matter of procedure, though the court seemed to be treating it as a formality. What no one yet realized was that Marcus's 5 words in that courtroom had cracked open a door that powerful people had spent years ensuring would remain firmly shut. Diana Reynolds had been a social worker in the Memphis child welfare system for 12 years, long enough to become simultaneously jaded and fiercely protective of the children in her care. At 38, the lines around her eyes told stories of too many cases, too many children failed by a system theoretically designed to protect them. When she received the Marcus Johnson file, something about it triggered her professional instincts. The documentation was too neat, too clean for a child who had been in the system for 7 years. As she drove to the Children's Services facility to meet with Marcus, she found herself wondering why a routine juvenile shoplifting case had resulted in such a rapid removal from his foster home based on one outburst. Marcus sat across from her in the sterile interview room, his posture guarded but his eyes alert. "Do you know why you're here?" Marcus Diana asked gently. The boy nodded. "Because I told the truth, and grown-ups don't like that." His directness surprised her. "Can you tell me why you said what you did to Judge Harrington?" Marcus was quiet for a moment, his small fingers tracing patterns on the table. "I remember her," he finally said. "From before. She was there when they took me from my mama." When Diana pressed for details, Marcus described fragments of memories, a hospital room with blue curtains, his mother crying, and the judge's face younger but unmistakable. She wore a necklace with a moon on it. Marcus added a detail so specific it gave Diana pause. Meanwhile, across town, Terrence Washington was being called into his supervisor's office at the Public Defender's Agency. Frank Malone, a veteran attorney with political aspirations, closed the door firmly behind Terrence. "I'm reassigning the Johnson case," he announced without preamble. When Terrence began to protest, Frank cut him off. "This is coming from above me. The boy made serious allegations against a sitting judge. It's become political." Terrence stood his ground. "He's my client, Frank. I've been building rapport with him for months." Frank's expression hardened. "Consider this friendly advice, Terrence. There are rumors you've been making inquiries about the judge. Drop it. There are career paths in this city that you do not want to block for yourself." The warning was clear, but it only strengthened Terrence's resolve. That evening, after officially being removed from the case, he began his own unofficial investigation. He started with Marcus's birth records, calling in a favor from an old law school friend who worked at the county records office. "Something's off with these documents," his friend told him over the phone. "The birth certificate looks legitimate at first glance, but the filing date is inconsistent with the hospital records." And there's no father listed, which isn't unusual. But there's also no signature from the mother on several forms where there should be. Terrence thanked him and hung up, the uneasiness in his stomach growing. The next day, he learned that Judge Harrington had used her influence to expedite Marcus's transfer to Lakeside Juvenile Detention Center, citing his pattern of delinquency and new concerns about mental stability. The move was unprecedented for a 10-year-old, with only minor offenses, especially before any psychological evaluation had been completed. Terrence pulled every string he could to gain access to Marcus at Lakeside. What he saw there only fueled his determination. The facility was predominantly filled with Black and Hispanic youth, many for offenses that would have resulted in probation for their white counterparts. Marcus was by far the youngest child there, isolated for his own protection in a small room that looked more like a cell than a safe space. "They don't believe me," Marcus said, when Terrence asked how he was being treated. "Nobody ever believes kids like me." Before Terrence left, Marcus mentioned something that seemed significant. "I have a mark on my shoulder," he said. "My real mom told me it looks like Africa. The judge has seen it. I know she has." The next day, Diana arranged for Marcus to receive a medical examination, standard procedure for children entering state custody. The doctor's report confirmed a distinctive birthmark on his right shoulder blade, roughly triangular in shape. Diana filed the information away, unsure of its significance, but unwilling to dismiss anything at this point. Across town, Judge Victoria Harrington was having lunch at an exclusive country club with District Attorney Calvin Montgomery, a tall, imposing man whose political ambitions were an open secret. They sat in a private corner, speaking in hushed tones. "This needs to disappear." Calvin Victoria said, her composed exterior betraying small cracks of anxiety. "The boy is clearly troubled, making up stories." Montgomery nodded, cutting his steak with precision. "I've already spoken to the appropriate people. The media narrative is established. No one believes him. But we need to be thorough. Make sure there's nothing that could corroborate his story, however fantastical." Victoria's hand trembled slightly as she reached for her water. "There's nothing to corroborate. But the Washington attorney concerns me. He's been asking questions." "Leave Washington to me," Montgomery assured her. "Focus on keeping your distance from the case now." Complete recusal, professional and appropriate. What neither of them knew was that Terrence had spent the previous evening discovering a curious gap in Judge Harrington's otherwise meticulously documented career. 5 years before she became a judge, Victoria Harrington had worked briefly for an organization called New Horizon Adoptions, a private agency that specialized in difficult placements. The agency had closed 3 years ago, its records supposedly transferred to the state system, but mysteriously difficult to access. That night, Marcus woke the entire juvenile wing with his screams. The night staff found him sobbing, clutching at his sheets. When Diana visited him the next morning, he showed her a drawing. He had made a crescent moon with a star inside it. "It's the necklace," he explained. "And I saw it other places too when I was little. Before the Thompsons." Diana photographed the drawing with her phone, a chill running through her that had nothing to do with the facility's aggressive air conditioning. Later that day, she found herself driving through South Memphis to the neighborhood where Shanice Johnson, Marcus's birth mother, had lived, according to the original case files. The area was predominantly Black, economically struggling, but with a strong sense of community evident in the well-kept community garden and the neighborhood watch signs. Diana spoke with an elderly woman who had lived on the block for 50 years. "I remember when they took that Johnson boy," the woman said, rocking slowly on her porch swing. "Wasn't the only one, neither. That year seemed like every time we turned around, another young mother was losing her baby to the system. All of them Black, all of them poor. Nobody could fight back against those fancy lawyers and doctors saying they weren't fit." As Diana drove back to her office, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had just touched the edge of something much larger and darker than one boy's confused accusations against a judge. The manila envelope arrived at Judge Victoria Harrington's chambers, with the morning mail unmarked except for her name typed on a plain label. Inside was a single photograph. Victoria, approximately 7 years younger, standing outside the New Horizon Adoptions office. Across the image, someone had written in red marker, We know what happened to those children." Victoria's hands shook so violently that she dropped the envelope, its contents spilling onto her desk. She quickly gathered the materials, shoving them into her desk drawer, just as her assistant knocked and entered with her daily schedule. How could anyone know? How could anyone prove anything? After all this time, the walls of her carefully constructed life suddenly felt paper-thin. Across town, Terrence Washington was navigating the crumbling sidewalks of South Memphis, looking for the current address he had for Shanice Johnson. The apartment building was run down, but clean security gates on the first-floor windows speaking to the neighborhood's challenges. Shanice opened the door, cautiously, chains still attached. At 32, her face showed the hardship of her life, but her eyes remained clear and intelligent. When Terrence explained who he was and why he had come, she invited him in with a wary hospitality. The apartment was small, but immaculate photos of Marcus prominently displayed on walls and shelves. "They told me he died," she said. After Terrence explained the situation, her voice flat with an anger so deep it had calcified. 3 days after he was born. Sudden infant death, they said. But they wouldn't let me see him, wouldn't even let me see his body. Terrence felt his professional demeanor crack. "Miss Johnson, according to official records, Marcus was removed from your care when he was 3 years old." Shanice's laugh was harsh, humorless. "I held my baby for 12 minutes after he was born. Then they said there were complications, took him to NICU. Next day, doctor came in saying he had died in the night, but I never believed it. Never felt it in my heart that he was gone." She showed Terrence a small box containing the few mementos she had of her son. A hospital bracelet, a single footprint on a card, a lock of hair. "I named him Marcus because it means warrior. Felt like he'd need to be one in this world." As Terrence left Shanice's apartment, his phone buzzed with a text from a number he didn't recognize. "Security footage from the day of Marcus's hearing has been erased. Not your imagination. Watch your back." The next morning brought news that the Thompsons had formally withdrawn, as Marcus's foster parents, claiming his accusations and behavior made him too troubled for their home. The real reason became clear when Gerald Thompson was quoted in the local paper saying, "We've done everything for that boy, given him opportunities most children from his background could only dream of. This is how he repays our Christian charity with lies and fantasy." The racial undertones were barely concealed, playing perfectly into the narrative being crafted about Marcus. What do you think about the Thompsons abandoning Marcus after his accusations? Comment number 1 if you think they were right to protect themselves, or number 2 if you believe they failed him when he needed support most. Like this video if you believe every child deserves advocates who stand by them through difficult times, and subscribe to follow Marcus's journey toward truth and justice. With powerful forces working against a single 10-year-old boy, could anyone truly protect Marcus from the system that seemed determined to silence him, or would the truth about his past remain buried forever? Terrence's investigation gained unexpected momentum when Courtney Adams, a clerk in the juvenile court, approached him outside the courthouse. "I shouldn't be doing this," she whispered, slipping him a thumb drive, "but my mama raised me right. There's something wrong with how black children are processed through this system, and that Johnson boy isn't the first to go through Judge Harrington's courtroom under strange circumstances." The drive contained dozens of case files spanning the past 7 years, showing a distinct pattern: black children, particularly those under 5, being removed from families on grounds that seemed increasingly dubious when compared side by side. Minor infractions, anonymous tips about neglect that couldn't be verified medical opinions, from the same small group of doctors citing vague concerns about development or attachment. And in a statistically impossible coincidence, nearly 60% of these children had eventually been fostered or adopted by wealthy white families connected to the same social circles. As this evidence mounted, Judge Harrington's pristine facade began showing cracks. Her assistant noticed her arriving with makeup, hastily covering dark circles under her eyes. Twice she excused herself in the middle of hearings, claiming illness. Once a colleague found her in her office, staring blankly at the wall, tears streaming down her face. She claimed allergies. When pressed about Marcus Johnson's case by reporters, she cited judicial ethics preventing her from commenting, but her voice wavered noticeably. Diana Reynolds continued her official investigation, interviewing Marcus daily. The boy's memories came in fragments, often triggered by seemingly unrelated questions. He described a room with pictures of horses racing where he had waited with other children, all of them black or Hispanic. He remembered a woman with hair like the judge speaking sharply to a man about inventory and quality merchandise. Most disturbingly, he recalled being told repeatedly that his mother didn't want him, that she had sold him, that he was lucky anyone would take a troubled boy like him. Meanwhile, media coverage of the case took an increasingly racialized turn. Local commentators questioned whether a black child from such a background could be considered reliable, with one particularly odious radio host suggesting that fabricating stories for attention is cultural for these communities. Civil rights organizations began to take notice, but their involvement only seemed to polarize public opinion further. Terrence's own investigation led him to a critical discovery. The prestigious Harrington Family Foundation, established by Victoria's father, Richard Harrington, had donated substantial sums to New Horizon adoptions during exactly the years Victoria had worked there. The foundation, ostensibly dedicated to improving outcomes for underprivileged children, had financial connections to at least a dozen organizations involved in adoption, foster care, and family court advocacy. It was Diana who made the next breakthrough. Looking at Marcus's drawing again, she realized the Crescent Moon logo matched the emblem of Crescent Moon Enterprises, a holding company owned by Richard Harrington with interests in healthcare, real estate, and private education. The connection seemed impossible to dismiss as coincidence. That evening, as Terrence was preparing to meet Diana to compare notes, he received an unexpected call from his law firm's managing partner. Senator Prescott's office called today. The partner said without preamble, referring to James Prescott, Victoria Harrington's husband and a powerful state senator. They expressed concerns about the firm's association with certain disruptive elements in the Johnson case. I don't need to tell you what the senator's goodwill means to our practice. The threat was clear, and the next day, Terrence was placed on administrative leave pending review. The official reason given was an irregularity in his handling of case files, a transparent pretext that fooled no one at the firm. Shanice Johnson faced pressure of a different kind. A representative from a concerned citizens group visited her apartment, offering $50,000 in cash if she would sign a statement denying she was Marcus's mother and move to another state. Think about the opportunities this money would create, the woman had said, her smile never reaching her eyes. A fresh start away from all these painful memories. Shanice showed her the door. The following morning, Diana received a call from a woman named Elaine Winters, identifying herself as a former nurse at Memphis General Hospital. "I've been following the case in the news," Elaine said, her voice tense. "That boy's claim about the judge. I think I might know something." They arranged to meet at a coffee shop far from both the hospital and the courthouse. Elaine, in her 60s, with silver hair and anxious eyes, kept glancing around the cafe as she spoke. "I worked in maternity for 22 years, she explained. Around 7 years ago, something changed. A new program was introduced for what they called special adoptions for unwanted children. It was presented as a compassionate option for mothers who couldn't care for their babies, primarily from disadvantaged backgrounds." Her hands trembled around her coffee cup. But there was nothing compassionate about it. Young mothers, mostly black and Hispanic, would be told there were complications with their babies. Sometimes the babies would be placed in NICU even though they were perfectly healthy. Then the mothers would be informed their babies had died suddenly. Diana felt her blood run cold. And the babies, Elaine's eyes filled with tears, processed through a private adoption system. Given new identities, new birth certificates, placed with families who paid enormous facilitation fees. Some of the doctors were involved falsifying records. And there was this woman who would come to the hospital regularly reviewing the available infants like they were products, young blonde. I never knew her name, but seeing Judge Harrington on the news. As Diana left the meeting, her professional composure barely intact, she called Terrence immediately. "We need to get Marcus out of that juvenile facility," she said, without greeting. "I think I know why he recognized the judge, and I think his life might be in danger." The rain fell in sheets, as Terrence Washington sat in his car outside the Harrington Family Foundation headquarters, a stately brick building in the wealthiest part of Memphis. Using his law firm credentials one last time before his inevitable termination, he had obtained the foundation's financial records for the past decade. What he found confirmed his worst suspicions. Between 8 and 5 years ago, the foundation had donated over $2 million to New Horizon adoptions listed as program support grants with minimal documentation. The timing aligned perfectly with Victoria Harrington's brief employment there before her rapid rise to the judiciary. Even more disturbing, several large payments had been made to a shell company that, when traced, led back to 3 specific doctors at Memphis General Hospital, all of whom had been involved in cases where black mothers were told their healthy babies had died. Diana Reynolds had spent the day following a different thread of the same dark tapestry. Marcus's drawing of the Crescent Moon logo had led her to Crescent Moon Enterprises, and from there to a web of subsidiaries, including private schools, medical clinics, and most disturbingly, a youth wellness center located in a remote area outside the city. Her research revealed that Richard Harrington, Victoria's father, had built his fortune first in real estate, then expanded into healthcare and education, always maintaining a public image of philanthropy and community service. His company motto, "Creating Better Futures for Deserving Children," took on a sinister double meaning in light of what they were uncovering. That evening, Terrence received a call from a blocked number. Washington, a male voice, said Senator Prescott would appreciate if you stopped this quixotic investigation immediately. Your career has such promise. Would be ashamed to destroy it over the delusions of a troubled child. Before Terrence could respond, the caller continued, "The Shelby County Bar Association takes ethics very seriously. Allegations of witness tampering, evidence manipulation. These things end careers, ruin lives." The call ended, leaving Terrence shaken but even more determined. The next morning, Shanice Johnson called Diana in a panic. "Someone offered me $20,000 to leave town today," she said. "When I refused, he said I should consider what happens to women who create problems for important people." Diana arranged for Shanice to stay with her sister in a different neighborhood and alerted police, though she had little faith in their responsiveness given the powers they were up against. Meanwhile, Marcus had his most revealing interview yet with a child psychologist assigned to evaluate him at the juvenile facility. When shown photographs of various Memphis buildings to test his claims, Marcus identified Judge Harrington's childhood home, a mansion in the historical district that had been featured in a local magazine. "That's where the room with the horses was," he said confidently, describing in detail a specific painting of a horse race that hung in what he called the waiting room. The psychologist, initially skeptical, was sufficiently disturbed by this accurate description to include it verbatim in her report. That afternoon, Terrence lost his job. The termination letter cited unprofessional conduct and unauthorized use of firm resources, but everyone knew the real reason. As he cleaned out his desk, his former colleagues avoided eye contact, fear of association evident in their body language. Only one. A young attorney named Michael Chen slipped him a business card. "My cousin works in the DA's office," he whispered. "Says electronic data from the adoption agency wasn't all destroyed. It's stored on an old server in the courthouse basement, backed up before the agency closed." Working now without institutional support, Terrence and Diana continued their parallel investigations, meeting each evening to share findings in a different location, each time increasingly paranoid about being followed or monitored. Their breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Elizabeth Harrington, Victoria's younger sister, reached out to Terrence through a mutual acquaintance. "I need to talk to you about Victoria and my father," she said over the phone, her voice tense. "About what they've been involved in. What our family name has been used to justify." They met at Elizabeth's apartment, a modest space that suggested estrangement from the family wealth. At 35, Elizabeth bore a striking resemblance to her sister, but where Victoria projected icy control, Elizabeth's demeanor was frenetic, anxious. "Victoria wasn't always like this," she began, pacing the small living room. "When we were younger, she was the protective one, the one with a conscience. Then she went to work for our father after law school, and something changed. Elizabeth revealed that Richard Harrington had been running what amounted to a private adoption network for decades, one that specifically targeted vulnerable minority families and provided premium children to wealthy white clients, willing to pay enormous sums for a simplified adoption process with guaranteed results. Victoria discovered what was happening about 7 years ago, Elizabeth continued. She was horrified at first, threatened to expose everything. Then suddenly she stopped objecting, started participating. I never understood why until I found the photos. She showed Terrence and Diana a shoebox containing old photographs, a teenage Victoria, with a young black man looking happy in love. His name was Marcus Washington. No relation to you, she added, glancing at Terrence. He was from South Memphis. Their relationship was secret, of course. Father would have disowned her, but I knew. I helped them meet. Elizabeth's voice cracked. She got pregnant at 19. Father found out, was furious. Marcus disappeared, suddenly supposedly moved away. Victoria was sent to a special facility for troubled girls. Came back months later. Different. Harder. Never spoke of Marcus or the baby again. Did everything Father asked after that, the perfect daughter? The implications were staggering. If true, this wasn't just about one child or even dozens. This was about a systematic operation spanning decades involving multiple institutions targeting specific communities. As Diana and Terrence left Elizabeth's apartment, each lost in thought about the ramifications of what they'd learned, neither noticed the black sedan that began following them at a discreet distance. That night, Victoria Harrington woke, screaming from a nightmare about a room with blue wallpaper clutching at her chest, as if in physical pain. Her husband, James, startled from sleep, reached for her in the darkness. "Vicky, you need to end this," he said, after she had calmed somewhat. "Whatever it takes. Your father agrees. The situation is becoming untenable." Victoria stared at him in the dim light filtering through their bedroom curtains. "Do you know what we did, James? Do you really understand?" He cut her off. "I understand that we've built something important, something that benefits everyone. A few unfortunate necessities along the way don't change that." His voice hardened. "Remember what happened the last time you developed a conscience, Victoria. Remember what you lost, what we still have to lose." At the juvenile detention facility, Marcus sat alone in his room, drawing the same symbol over and over, the crescent moon and star. Something was coming back to him. Something important about the judge, and why he had recognized her so immediately, so viscerally. Not just from the hospital room when he was taken, but from somewhere else, some earlier memory buried deep. The next day, the DNA test results that had been ordered as part of Marcus's case mysteriously disappeared from the laboratory that had processed them. When Diana called to inquire, she was told there had been a processing error, and the samples had been accidentally discarded. New samples would be needed, with results taking an additional 2 weeks. Meanwhile, Marcus remained in juvenile detention, isolated and increasingly withdrawn, as the machinery of a corrupt system worked to ensure that his voice would never be heard and his claims never verified. The abandoned warehouse outside Memphis seemed an unlikely nexus for a child trafficking operation. But as Terrence and Diana approached cautiously, flashlights cutting through the darkness, the building's remote location made strategic sense. The tip had come from Elizabeth Harrington. This facility, owned by one of Crescent Moon Enterprises' subsidiaries, had allegedly served as a temporary housing location for children in transit through the illegal adoption network. Despite the risk of trespassing charges, they had decided the potential evidence was worth the gamble. Inside, the building appeared to have been hastily cleared out, but not thoroughly enough. In what seemed to have been an office, they found shredded documents that, when painstakingly reconstructed, revealed a partial list of inventory with dates, identification numbers, and racial classifications. In another room, faded murals of cartoon characters covered walls, equipped with attachment points for restraints disguised as decorative elements. Most damning was a small closet containing forgotten photographs, groups of children, predominantly black and Hispanic, dressed in matching clothes and posed artificially labeled with numbers rather than names. "Documentation for prospective clients," Diana whispered, her voice tight with horror and rage. They were selling these kids like luxury products. Terrence nodded grimly, carefully securing every scrap of evidence in sealed evidence bags, his lawyer's training superseding his shock. "We need to get Marcus's statement again," he said. "Detailed, recorded with specific questions about this place. If he can describe it accurately." Diana finished his thought. "Then we can prove he was here, which connects him directly to the network." The next morning, Elizabeth Harrington met them at Diana's apartment, bringing more evidence, internal memos from the Harrington Foundation, detailing selection criteria for identifying suitable candidates from target demographics. Her hands shook as she spread the documents on Diana's kitchen table. Victoria tried to fight it at first. Elizabeth explained, her voice hollow. "When she discovered what our father was really doing with the adoption agency, she threatened to go public. That's when he showed her the evidence." Elizabeth's eyes filled with tears. "Our father had her boyfriend Marcus murdered when he found out about the pregnancy. Made it look like a gang killing in South Memphis. Then he gave her a choice: cooperate, or he'd make sure she was implicated in the death. He had photographs, planted evidence. He owned judges, police captains. She would have gone to prison for a crime our father committed." The revelation cast Victoria's involvement in a new light, complicated but not exculpatory. She had made choices that devastated hundreds of families to protect herself. Across town, Judge Victoria Harrington sat in her home office staring at her computer screen without seeing it. The nightmares had become unbearable, vivid memories she had suppressed for years now, surfacing nightly. A specific blue room haunted her most frequently, a waiting area at her father's facility, where children were kept before being presented to prospective parents. In her dreams, the children's faces kept transforming into her own lost child, the baby taken from her at 19 and supposedly given to a suitable family by her father. A child she had never seen again, whose fate remained unknown to her, a wound that had never healed. Her phone rang, startling her from her dark reverie. It was her father. "Victoria, we have a situation," Richard Harrington said without preamble. The Washington lawyer and that social worker gained access to the old processing facility. Elizabeth has been talking to them. The situation is deteriorating rapidly. Victoria felt something break inside her, a dam holding back 20 years of accumulated grief and guilt. "Let it deteriorate," she said quietly. "It's time." Richard's voice turned cold. "You're not thinking clearly, Victoria. Remember your position, everything you've worked for, everything I've built for this family. Built on stolen children," Victoria responded, a strange calm settling over her. "On broken families. On lives we destroyed because they didn't matter to people like us. They were better off," Richard snapped. "We gave those children opportunities they never would have had otherwise. Better lives, better futures. That wasn't our decision to make," Victoria whispered, then hung up. She sat motionless for several minutes, then began methodically copying files from a hidden folder on her computer to a thumb drive. The next day brought news that would accelerate the unraveling conspiracy. Marcus Johnson had escaped from the juvenile detention center. An empathetic guard, moved by the boy's situation and disturbed by orders to keep him isolated, had deliberately left a service door unlocked during her shift. By morning, Marcus was gone with no indication of where he might have fled. The official response was immediate and disproportionate. An Amber Alert was issued. Marcus's face appeared on digital billboards across the city, described as potentially dangerous despite his age and size. Police conducted aggressive sweeps through predominantly black neighborhoods. Senator Prescott gave a press conference calling for increased security measures at juvenile facilities, using Marcus's escape to further a tough-on-crime agenda specifically targeting minority communities. What the authorities didn't know was that Marcus, showing remarkable resourcefulness for a 10-year-old, had made his way across the city to the only place he thought might be safe, his birth mother's apartment. Shanice Johnson was hanging laundry when she heard a small voice behind her say, "Mama." She turned to find a boy she had thought dead for 7 years, standing in her living room, thin and trembling, but unmistakably hers. The birthmark on his shoulder, the shape of his eyes, the curl of his hair, all exactly as she remembered. Their reunion was tearful, intense, both of them clutching each other as if afraid the other might disappear. Neither heard the car that parked across the street or noticed the man who began photographing the apartment building. Terrence, meanwhile, had been following financial leads, tracking millions of dollars flowing through Crescent Moon Enterprises into offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands and Switzerland. The money trail revealed payments to hospital administrators, family court judges, and child welfare officials across 3 states. The operation was vastly larger than they had initially suspected, involving potentially thousands of children over at least 15 years. As he compiled this evidence, Diana received a call from a former colleague at Social Services who had been helping them quietly. "Someone's been altering case files," the woman whispered. "Going through the digital archives, changing dates, details, creating backfilled documentation. My supervisor caught me looking at the Marcus Johnson file and nearly fired me on the spot. Whatever this is, it goes all the way to the top." That evening, Judge Victoria Harrington did something unexpected. She drove alone to her father's mansion, entered using her key, and proceeded directly to his home office. Richard Harrington, 72, but still imposing, looked up from his desk in surprise. "Victoria, we weren't expecting you for dinner until tomorrow." Victoria placed a recording device visibly on his desk. "I want you to tell me what happened to my baby," she said, her voice steady despite her trembling hands. "The one you took from me 20 years ago. The one you said would be placed with a good family if I cooperated with your plans." Richard's face hardened. "Turn that off immediately." Victoria didn't move. "I've spent 20 years helping you steal other women's children. I think I've earned the right to know what happened to mine." What followed was a confrontation 2 decades in the making, with Victoria finally demanding answers about her own child's fate, while her father alternated between threats, manipulation, and cold business logic about his adoption. Enterprise. Unknown to either of them, the entire conversation was being transmitted to Terrence Washington's phone, providing the first direct evidence of Richard Harrington's involvement from his own mouth. Across town, a man named Gregory Palmer, former security chief for Crescent Moon Enterprises, sat across from Terrence and Diana in a nondescript hotel room. Palmer had approached them, offering information in exchange for immunity. "I'm not going down with this ship," he said bluntly. "I handled security, transported kids, made problems disappear. But I kept insurance." He produced a flash drive containing photographs, videos, and documents spanning 12 years. Among them were images of Judge Victoria Harrington at the processing facility, clearly pregnant herself in the earliest photos, later shown selecting children with her father. "She was involved from the beginning," Palmer stated flatly. "Whatever story she's telling now, she was all in." The evidence painted a complex picture. Victoria herself, a victim of her father's manipulation, nonetheless becoming complicit in victimizing others. As these various threads began to converge, the danger intensified. Marcus and Shanice's emotional reunion was cut short when 2 men attempted to force their way into the apartment that night. Only the intervention of neighbors responding to Shanice's screams prevented what might have been a kidnapping or worse. Terrence's car was vandalized. The word "stop" scratched deeply into the hood. Diana returned home to find her apartment had been searched, though nothing was taken. Elizabeth Harrington was not so fortunate. She was found unconscious in her bathroom, an apparent overdose that seemed suspicious given her known sobriety for the past 5 years. As she was rushed to the hospital, Victoria was notified as next of kin. Standing in the hospital corridor, watching doctors work to save her sister, Victoria made a decision that would change everything. She reached for her phone and called Terrence Washington. "I'm ready to talk," she said when he answered. "About everything. About my father, about the children, about Marcus Johnson and why he recognized me." Her voice broke slightly. "And about my own son, who would be 20 now. The reason all of this began." The attack came without warning, 2 men in dark clothing breaking through the back door of Shanice Johnson's apartment just after midnight. Shanice, who had been sleeping fitfully on the couch while Marcus occupied her bedroom, had only seconds to react. Grabbing a baseball bat kept beside the couch for protection, she fought back with the ferocity of a mother who had already lost her child once. Her screams alerted neighbors, one of whom fired a warning shot into the air from his legally owned firearm. The assailants fled, leaving behind a syringe that would later test positive for a powerful sedative. Shanice and Marcus escaped through a neighbor's apartment, the community forming a protective barrier around them until Terrence could arrive and take them to a motel outside the city limits. Marcus, shaken but remarkably composed, described one of the attackers. "He was at the place with the horse pictures, too. He used to bring us food sometimes." The attempted abduction marked a dangerous escalation. Whoever was behind the conspiracy was growing desperate as more evidence emerged and more witnesses came forward. Terrence returned to his apartment that night to find it completely ransacked. Every file, every note related to the case had been taken or destroyed. His computer was missing, though he had fortunately kept critical evidence on encrypted drives stored elsewhere. Most disturbing was a glossy photograph left prominently on his bed. Terrence himself outside the courthouse, crosshairs drawn over his face in red marker. The message was unambiguous. Diana Reynolds faced intimidation of a different kind. Her supervisor called her into his office the next morning, placing a formal reprimand in her file for unauthorized investigation and breach of confidentiality protocols. When Diana defended her actions as necessary to protect a child in her care, the supervisor's response was chilling. "There are thousands of children in the system, Miss Reynolds. Your fixation on this one case suggests a concerning lack of perspective. Perhaps a psychological evaluation is in order before you return to full duties." It was a calculated move to discredit her professionally laying groundwork, to dismiss any evidence she might present as the product of an unstable mind. Meanwhile, Elizabeth Harrington's overdose had created an unexpected opportunity. As she lay unconscious in the hospital, Victoria maintained a vigil at her bedside, genuinely distraught, but also using the situation as cover to avoid her father and husband. In Elizabeth's apartment, searching for any indication of what might have triggered the overdose, Victoria discovered a hidden cache of documents her sister had compiled over years. Financial records, photographs, even recorded. Conversations with former employees of the Harrington Enterprises. The evidence was damning, confirming what Victoria already knew, but had denied to herself the systematic targeting of vulnerable Black and Hispanic communities for what amounted to child trafficking under the guise of adoption services. The documentation showed how hospital staff were instructed to identify pregnant women who were young, poor, undereducated, or otherwise vulnerable. Doctors were paid bonuses for each child successfully entered into the program. Court officials received consulting fees to expedite removals and terminations of parental rights. The entire operation was couched in language of charity and opportunity, but the underlying racist ideology was clear in internal communications about improving outcomes by placing children of color with culturally and economically advantaged white families. What do you believe is the most disturbing aspect of this conspiracy? Comment number 1, if it's the racial targeting of vulnerable families. Number 2, if it's the involvement of trusted institutions like hospitals and courts. Or number 3, if it's how money corrupted the entire system meant to protect children. Like this video, if you believe every child deserves to know their true heritage and family, and subscribe to follow this story to its conclusion. With powerful enemies closing in from all sides, could Terrence, Diana, and Shanice protect Marcus long enough to expose the truth, or would the Harrington family's wealth and influence once again allow them to escape justice? Victoria made her decision. Using Elizabeth's recording equipment, she began documenting her own testimony, detailing her father's operation from its inception, her own coerced participation, and the fates of dozens of children she could specifically remember. She named judges, doctors, officials who had been complicit, and she described the system's inner workings in meticulous detail, from how mothers were targeted to how massive sums of money changed hands through shell companies and offshore accounts. While Victoria created her record, Terrence and Diana worked to assemble the scattered pieces of evidence into a coherent case that could withstand the inevitable legal challenges. They established a secure digital repository with triple backups, sharing access credentials with trusted journalists at national publications, set to automatically unlock if any of them failed to enter a daily code. It was insurance against the very real possibility that they might not survive to present their evidence personally. Marcus and Shanice remained in hiding, moving between budget motels outside Memphis, their whereabouts known only to Terrence and Diana. During these uncertain days, Shanice began the delicate process of rebuilding a relationship with the son she had thought dead for 7 years. Marcus, mature beyond his years from hardship, alternated between childlike need for his mother's comfort and a wary self-sufficiency developed through years in foster care. "Did you ever stop looking for me?" he asked one night, as they shared a meal of fast food in their latest temporary refuge. Shanice's eyes filled with tears. "Never," she said. "I kept your things. Talked to you every night before bed. Some people thought I was crazy, couldn't accept reality. But a mother knows, Marcus. In her heart she knows." Their tentative reconnection was one small point of light in an increasingly dangerous situation. Across town, Richard Harrington was mobilizing considerable resources to contain the threat to his empire. Security at his companies was increased. Key employees were sent on sudden vacations. Digital records were being systematically scrubbed from servers. And most concerning, Senator James Prescott had begun floating legislation about frivolous accusations against judicial officers and penalties for defamation of public officials, transparent attempts to create additional barriers to exposure. The breakthrough that finally cracked the case open came from an unexpected source. Gregory Palmer, the former security chief who had provided initial evidence, reached out again with critical information: the existence of a comprehensive database of all special adoptions handled through the network. Harrington was a businessman first, Palmer explained in a tense meeting at a highway rest stop. He kept records of everything, all compartmentalized, so no one person had the full picture. But the main database exists. Children's original identities, their assigned new identities, birth families, adoptive families, payments, everything. The database was stored on a dedicated server at Crescent Moon headquarters. Palmer explained accessible only through Richard Harrington's private terminal with biometric security. He provided the specific location security protocols, and a crucial piece of information: Richard still accessed these records every month to track ongoing payments from families who had essentially purchased children through his network. As Terrence and Diana formulated a plan to somehow access this evidence, the racial dimensions of the case became increasingly visible in public discourse. Civil rights organizations began holding rallies supporting Marcus and Shanice. Community leaders from affected neighborhoods came forward with their own stories of children mysteriously removed from families. And investigative journalists began connecting the statistical dots: hundreds of Black and Hispanic children from specific Memphis neighborhoods had disappeared into the system over the past 15 years, with documentation that, when examined closely, showed troubling inconsistencies and procedural irregularities. A national cable news program ran a segment titled "Modern-Day Child Stealing," explicitly connecting current practices to historical exploitation of Black families. The piece featured interviews with families who believed they had been victimized by the same network, all describing similar experiences: medical emergencies, sudden removals, expedited terminations of parental rights, and children placed with wealthy white families who made substantial donations to certain foundations and agencies. The segment went viral, creating pressure that local officials could no longer ignore. Victoria Harrington watched the program alone in her home office, her husband away in Washington for a Senate session. As faces of grieving, Black mothers filled her screen, women who had experienced exactly what she had orchestrated hundreds of times, something final broke within her. She gathered the evidence she had compiled, including her recorded testimony, and drove to Terrence Washington's office, calling him en route to ensure he would be there. Their meeting, tense and emotional, lasted 3 hours. Victoria provided everything she had collected, answered every question Terrence posed, and signed a sworn affidavit detailing her involvement and all she had witnessed. "Why now?" Terrence asked as their meeting concluded. After all these years, all these children, Victoria's composed facade crumbled. "Because of Marcus Johnson," she admitted. "When he pointed at me in that courtroom, called me out by name, it was like seeing a ghost. Not because I remembered him specifically from the hundreds of children that passed through our hands, but because he has my son's eyes. My baby, the one my father took from me 20 years ago. I never knew what happened to him, but seeing Marcus the same age my child was when taken from his mother." She couldn't continue, overwhelmed by the weight of her complicity in inflicting her own deepest wound on countless other women. As Victoria left the meeting, the evidence secure, with Terrence neither noticed the black SUV that pulled away from the curb to follow her. That night, an attempt was made on Victoria's life. A single shot was fired through her kitchen window as she prepared tea, missing her head by inches. Police responded quickly, but the shooter had vanished, leaving only a .308 caliber shell casing in the grass outside. Victoria was placed under police protection ostensibly for her safety, though Terrence worried it was equally about controlling her access and movements now that she had become a whistleblower. The attempt on Victoria's life changed the dynamics of the case dramatically. Whatever her past crimes, she was now clearly viewed as a liability by those still protecting the conspiracy. And her near assassination pushed fence-sitting officials to finally take the allegations seriously. The FBI officially took over the investigation the next day, agents arriving at Crescent Moon Enterprises with warrants for financial records, communication logs, and access to all computer systems. Senator Prescott rushed back from Washington, publicly supporting the investigation while privately making frantic calls to allies in federal law enforcement. Richard Harrington, 72 but still formidable, stood in his office, watching FBI agents boxing documents, his expression revealing nothing. "This is a misunderstanding," he told reporters gathered outside. "The Harrington family has dedicated generations to improving this community. These allegations are absurd and will be proven false." But his confident veneer cracked when agents acting on specific intelligence from Victoria located the hidden server room Palmer had described and secured the database containing records of every child processed through the network. The system had meticulously tracked nearly 800 children over 17 years, most of them, Black or Hispanic, taken from families in specifically targeted low-income neighborhoods and placed with wealthy white families who had paid amounts ranging from $50,000 to $200,000 per child. Among the names in that database was Marcus Johnson, his original identity, his biological mother's name, and his path through the system documented in cold, businesslike detail. And on another list, one that Richard Harrington had kept completely separate, was a single entry from 20 years earlier, Victoria's male infant placement with Westbrook Family, Boston. The truth that had remained hidden for so long was finally exposed to the light, a conspiracy of breathtaking scope and cruelty laid bare for all to see. Judge Victoria Harrington's collapse happened in full public view during an unrelated domestic case hearing. Mid-sentence, she stopped speaking, stared blankly ahead for several seconds, then began to sob uncontrollably. Court officers quickly cleared the room as Victoria slumped forward onto her bench, 20 years of compartmentalized guilt and trauma finally overwhelming her carefully maintained facade. She was taken by ambulance to Memphis Memorial Hospital, sedated, and placed under observation for what was officially described as exhaustion and stress-related complications. The media reported sympathetically on her condition, portraying her as potentially another victim of her father's schemes, though public opinion remained sharply divided, particularly along racial lines. Many in the Black community viewed her apparent breakdown as too convenient a strategic move to evade responsibility, just as the evidence against her became overwhelming. That evening, Victoria checked herself out of the hospital against medical advice and did something unexpected. She drove to Oakwood, her childhood home, a sprawling colonial mansion set on 10 acres in the most exclusive neighborhood of Memphis. The estate had stood empty since Richard Harrington moved to a downtown penthouse 5 years earlier, maintained by staff but unoccupied. Victoria used her key to enter, moving through the silent sheet-covered rooms like a ghost, revisiting its own past. She made her way to the third floor to a specific room she had avoided thinking about for decades. The blue wallpaper had faded, but the horse racing prints still hung exactly as she remembered. This had been the special waiting room where children were kept temporarily during the transition process, where she had first seen the systematic nature of her father's operation, and where she had made her choice to participate rather than resist. Alone in that room, surrounded by the physical evidence of past crimes, Victoria experienced what psychiatrists would later describe as a cascading memory event. Suppressed recollections returned in overwhelming detail. Her father's cold explanation of how her pregnancy would be handled, the months of isolation at a private facility until her baby was born, the brief moment she had held her son before he was taken away, and then the gradual process by which she was drawn into the family business, first as a reluctant participant, then as an active facilitator. Most painful was the memory of her father's ultimatum: cooperate or be prosecuted for her boyfriend's murder. A crime Richard himself had orchestrated but carefully linked to Victoria through planted evidence. She had made her choice, and hundreds of families had paid the price for her weakness. As these memories surfaced, Victoria did something she had never done before. She began methodically photographing and documenting the room, measuring spaces, noting details about the building's layout that would corroborate victims' statements. She was building a case against herself as much as against her father. Across town, Senator James Prescott was engaged in damage control, giving an exclusive interview to a sympathetic local news anchor. "My wife is a victim in all this." He insisted, his practiced political sincerity on full display. Manipulated by her father from a young age, forced into impossible situations. When all the facts come to light, people will understand that Victoria was as much a victim as anyone. What the senator didn't know was that Victoria had already provided Terrence with evidence of his own deep involvement, recordings of conversations in which Prescott had discussed continuing the operation through different channels, after New Horizon Adoptions closed, using his political connections to shield the ongoing activities from scrutiny. Meanwhile, Terrence and Diana continued building their case, now with FBI cooperation. The database seized from Crescent Moon Enterprises provided the framework, but supporting documentation was needed to make charges stick against all involved parties. They focused particularly on the medical aspects of the conspiracy, interviewing former hospital staff and reviewing records of supposed infant deaths and medical complications that had separated mothers from their children. A clear pattern emerged. Hospital staff had been explicitly instructed to target mothers from poor, primarily black neighborhoods. Young single, undereducated women were particularly vulnerable, often overwhelmed by medical terminology and authority figures in emergency situations. Documents showed that certain doctors received consultation fees of $5,000 to $10,000 for each child successfully entered into the network, with bonuses for children with specific desirable characteristics. The racism inherent in the operation was explicit in internal communications, with references to improving genetic outcomes and providing better cultural environments for the children. One particularly damning email from Richard Harrington to a hospital administrator stated, "These communities produce more children than they can properly raise. We're providing a service to society by redistributing these children to families with the resources and values to develop their full potential." The FBI investigation expanded rapidly, with agents conducting simultaneous raids on multiple locations connected to the Harrington network. At a storage facility rented under a shell company name, they discovered thousands of pages of original documentation that had supposedly been destroyed: birth records, altered death certificates, fraudulent adoption papers, and financial transactions, tracking payments from adoptive families to various Harrington-controlled entities. Most disturbing was a set of photographs found in a fireproof safe, hundreds of children, photographed like merchandise, with notations about physical characteristics, temperament, and market value. Marcus Johnson appeared in one such photograph, aged approximately 3. His file noting his exceptional intelligence and adaptability qualities that apparently increased his placement value. As this evidence mounted, Marcus himself continued to demonstrate an uncanny ability to provide details about locations and individuals connected to the conspiracy. During an interview with FBI agents conducted with Diana present as his advocate, he accurately described Victoria Harrington's private office, including a specific arrangement of family photographs on her desk that he could not have seen during his brief court appearance. "She took me there once," he explained, "after they told my real mama I was dead, before they gave me to the first family." His memories, fragmented but specific, matched too many verified details to be dismissed as confabulation. 3 days into the FBI investigation, Elizabeth Harrington awoke from her medically induced coma. Though weak and disoriented, she immediately asked for law enforcement officials and gave a sworn statement from her hospital bed, confirming everything Victoria had revealed and adding critical details about operations after the official closure of New Horizon adoptions. The agency closing was just for show, Elizabeth told investigators. The operation continued through different channels, using private medical clinics, home birth midwives who were on the payroll, and a network of corrupt family court officials who would expedite removals and terminate parental rights with minimal evidence. Her testimony directly implicated several prominent Memphis officials, including 2 family court judges, an assistant district attorney, and the chief of obstetrics at Memphis General Hospital. With Elizabeth's statement secured and Victoria now actively cooperating with the investigation, Senator Prescott made a desperate attempt to contain the damage. He called a press conference, announcing his shock and heartbreak at the allegations, positioning himself as completely unaware of his father-in-law's activities and his wife's involvement. As a public servant dedicated to protecting the most vulnerable among us, he declared with practiced sincerity, "I am devastated to learn that my own family may have been involved in these unconscionable acts. I pledge my full cooperation with investigators and call for justice regardless of who may be implicated." Behind the scenes, however, Prescott was orchestrating a different response. Terrence received a phone call that evening from a former colleague at his law firm. "Prescott is searching for anything in your background to discredit you," the colleague warned. "Old cases, disgruntled clients, college indiscretions, anything. He's got people digging through everything from your bar application to your credit history." Similar efforts were underway to undermine Diana, with anonymous complaints suddenly filed against her with the state social work licensing board alleging unprofessional conduct and boundary violations with clients. The coordinated nature of these attacks made clear that despite the mounting evidence, powerful forces were still working to protect themselves. The turning point came when Victoria Harrington, having spent the night in her childhood home, surrounded by evidence of past crimes, made a decision that surprised everyone. She contacted the FBI and offered to testify against her father, her husband, and herself, providing a complete account of the operation from its inception to its current form. In exchange, she asked for nothing except the opportunity to publicly apologize to the families who had been victimized and to help locate as many affected children as possible. To demonstrate her sincerity, she provided agents with access to a safety deposit box containing what she called her insurance policy detailed records she had secretly maintained for years, documenting every child she had personal knowledge of, including names, dates, original families, and adoptive placements. The documents revealed that Victoria had been playing a double game for years, appearing to cooperate with her father's operation while quietly creating a record that could someday expose it all. It wasn't enough to absolve her of responsibility, but it did suggest a complexity to her involvement that would factor into eventual prosecutions. Richard Harrington, sensing the walls closing in, made arrangements to leave the country. His private jet was fueled and ready at a small airport outside Memphis. Flight plan filed for Zurich, Switzerland, where he maintained banking relationships and property. He cited an urgent need for specialized medical treatment unavailable in the United States, a transparent pretext, but one that might buy crucial time to move assets and establish himself beyond American jurisdiction. What he didn't know was that federal authorities, alerted by Victoria, were monitoring his movements and had already frozen his primary accounts. As Richard's car approached the private airfield, it was surrounded by FBI vehicles. The man who had orchestrated the theft of hundreds of children was taken into custody without incident, his expression betraying nothing as he was led away in handcuffs. The arrest made national news coverage focusing on the stark image of the wealthy white patriarch being processed like any other criminal, a man whose philanthropy had disguised decades of predation on vulnerable communities. For Marcus Johnson, watching the news coverage from the safe house, where he and Shanice were staying under FBI protection, the moment brought complex emotions. "Is it over?" he asked Terrence, who had come to update them on developments. "Will they believe me now?" Terrence placed his hand gently on the boy's shoulder. "Yes, they'll believe you. Your courage made this happen, Marcus. You spoke up when no one else would, and you kept speaking even when powerful people tried to silence you. What no one yet fully understood, however, was just how deep the conspiracy extended and how many powerful interests would be threatened by its complete exposure." Senator Prescott, despite his public posture of shocked innocence, was already mobilizing allies in federal law enforcement and the Justice Department seeking to limit the scope of the investigation and shield certain high-profile participants from scrutiny. The battle had shifted from exposing the truth to ensuring that justice would actually be served, and the outcome remained far from certain. Victoria Harrington's hospital room was guarded by 2 FBI agents, a precaution following the attempt on her life, but also ensuring she remained available for ongoing questioning. Pale against the white sheets, an IV delivering fluids to her dehydrated body, she looked nothing like the imposing judge who had presided over countless cases with icy efficiency. For the past 6 hours, she had been providing a detailed statement to federal prosecutors, declining the presence of an attorney despite multiple cautions about self-incrimination. "I've been complicit in crimes against hundreds of families," she said when the lead prosecutor expressed surprise at her cooperation. "I don't deserve legal protection." From her hospital bed, Victoria signed an 18-page affidavit confirming the existence and operation of the child trafficking network, her own role within it, and the involvement of numerous Memphis officials, including her husband. The document detailed how the operation had evolved over 2 decades, adapting to increased regulations and scrutiny by moving activities further underground and spreading them across multiple entities to obscure the connections. Victoria's testimony proved to be the key that unlocked the entire case. With her affidavit in hand, FBI agents executed search warrants on Senator Prescott's offices, Richard Harrington's various properties, and the private residences of 6 other individuals implicated in the conspiracy. The evidence recovered was overwhelming financial records, showing millions of dollars flowing through shell companies, documentation of bribes paid to officials, and most damning, the complete client list of wealthy families who had knowingly purchased children through the network. While these operations were underway, another team of FBI agents and computer specialists worked to recover deleted files from the servers seized at Crescent Moon Enterprises. The technical staff succeeded in reconstructing the most critical database, revealing the full scope of the operation. 812 children processed through the network over 17 years, predominantly from Black and Hispanic families placed with wealthy white families who had paid amounts ranging from $50,000 to over $200,000, depending on the child's age, appearance, and perceived adaptability. The database contained another crucial piece of information: the DNA profiles of every child who had passed through the system. This had been maintained as a quality control measure, ensuring children with genetic disorders or other undesirable traits were identified before placement with paying clients. Now, these same profiles would help reunite families and confirm identities of children who had been stolen years earlier. For Marcus Johnson, the most significant development came 3 days into the federal investigation: the recovery and verification of his DNA results. Tests confirmed what Shanice had known in her heart. Marcus was indeed her biological son, taken from her through the Harrington Network's hospital scheme when she was told he had died shortly after birth. What the tests also revealed, however, was something no one had anticipated. Marcus was not related to Victoria Harrington or anyone in the Harrington family. The judge's recognition of him, her extreme reaction to his accusation in court, had been triggered by something else entirely. That mystery was solved when agents searching Richard Harrington's private office discovered a hidden safe containing files on what he called special cases. Among them was a folder labeled Victoria's Liability, containing photographs and documents related to her pregnancy at 19 and the child she had delivered while essentially held captive at a private facility. The file included a DNA profile of the infant boy and tracking information showing he had been placed with the Westbrook family in Boston, given the name Alexander, and raised without knowledge of his origins. According to the file, Victoria's son had died in a swimming accident at age 8, a fact Richard had deliberately kept from his daughter to maintain his leverage over her. Victoria's breakdown upon seeing Marcus in her courtroom hadn't been about recognition of him specifically, but a reaction to his age and appearance, triggering memories of the child she had lost. The son who would have been the same age as Marcus when he was taken from Shanice. This revelation added another layer of tragedy to the case, showing how Richard Harrington had weaponized his own daughter's trauma to ensure her compliance in inflicting similar pain on hundreds of other women. As the FBI investigation expanded, the true scope of the conspiracy began to emerge. Search warrants executed at multiple locations uncovered evidence implicating dozens of prominent Memphis citizens, hospital administrators, family court judges, social workers, adoption attorneys, and wealthy donors to the Harrington Family Foundation. What had begun as Richard Harrington's private operation had evolved into an entrenched system protected by money and influence that systematically targeted vulnerable families in specific neighborhoods. The racial component was explicit in internal communications, with references to improving outcomes for unplanned children from disadvantaged backgrounds, serving as thinly veiled justification for targeting Black and Hispanic communities. One particularly damning email from Senator Prescott to a campaign donor stated, "These children are better off with families who can provide proper American values and opportunities. Their biological situations are unsuitable for developing productive citizens." Terrence Washington and Diana Reynolds, now officially consulting with the FBI investigation, focused on organizing evidence for potential prosecutions. Their efforts were complicated by the high-profile nature of many suspects and the political connections that created pressure to limit the scope of charges. "They're already trying to frame this as a few bad actors rather than a systemic operation," Terrence told Diana as they reviewed case files in a temporary FBI office. "We need to ensure the racial targeting is explicitly acknowledged in the charges. This wasn't just child trafficking. It was a racist system preying specifically on Black and Hispanic families." Diana nodded, adding, "And we need to center the families in all of this. The Harringtons and their cronies are getting all the headlines, but the real story is hundreds of mothers like Shanice, who had their children stolen and their grief dismissed." As federal prosecutors built their case, a parallel effort began to locate and support all victims of the trafficking network. A dedicated task force was established, combining resources from the FBI Department of Health and Human Services and several nonprofit organizations specializing in family reunification. The process would be complex and delicate, involving children now living with families who may or may not have known the true origins of their adoptions. For older children and teenagers who had spent most of their lives with their current families, questions of identity and belonging would be particularly challenging. Younger children might face sudden disruption of the only homes they had known. The task force established a protocol prioritizing the psychological well-being of the children while acknowledging the fundamental rights of biological families who had been victims of fraud and exploitation. Throughout this process, Marcus Johnson's case remained at the center of public attention. His courage in confronting Judge Harrington had broken open the entire conspiracy, and his ongoing recovery and reunification with Shanice provided a powerful narrative of resilience and justice. With Diana's help, Shanice had secured appropriate counseling for both herself and Marcus, beginning the long process of healing from their traumatic separation and building a relationship after 7 years apart. 6 days into the federal investigation, a significant breakthrough occurred. One of the doctors heavily implicated in the scheme agreed to cooperate in exchange for leniency. Dr. Lawrence Freeman, former chief of obstetrics at Memphis General Hospital, provided detailed testimony about how the operation functioned at the medical level. He described how vulnerable mothers, predominantly young black women without strong family support or financial resources, would be targeted during prenatal care or upon admission for delivery. Various strategies were employed to separate mothers from their newborns. False claims of medical emergencies manipulated test results, suggesting serious conditions requiring specialized care, or in some cases, simply telling mothers their babies had died while actually transferring them to the network. We were instructed to target specific demographic profiles, Dr. Freeman testified. Young single mothers from certain zip codes, women on public assistance, those with limited education or family support. The Harrington operation had specific criteria for what they called suitable candidates for intervention. His testimony directly connected the medical fraud to the explicitly racial targeting of the overall operation, providing prosecutors with critical evidence for hate crime enhancements to the numerous federal charges being prepared. As these revelations continued to unfold, media coverage shifted dramatically. Initial skepticism about Marcus's claims gave way to outrage at the systematic exploitation of vulnerable families. Civil rights organizations held rallies demanding justice and supporting the affected communities. Historical context began appearing in news analysis, connecting the Harrington operation to a long history of children of color being taken from their families through various means, from slavery to forced boarding schools, to discriminatory child welfare practices. Public figures who had previously associated with the Harrington Foundation distanced themselves, corporations withdrew donations, and politicians returned campaign contributions from Richard Harrington and Senator Prescott. The story had transcended local crime reporting to become a national conversation about race, power, and justice. For Marcus and Shanice Johnson, vindication came with its own challenges. Their privacy was constantly under threat from media seeking interviews and photographers camping outside Diana's home where they were staying temporarily. Despite FBI protection, they received hate mail from those who refused to believe the Harringtons could be guilty, or worse, from those who explicitly supported the idea of removing black children from their communities. Yet amid these difficulties, they were sustained by the overwhelming support from their own community and the growing public recognition of the injustice they had suffered. 10 days after Richard Harrington's arrest, as the investigation continued gathering evidence and identifying victims, Victoria Harrington requested a meeting with Marcus and Shanice. After careful consideration and consultation with their therapist, they agreed to a supervised encounter at a neutral location. The meeting, witnessed by Diana, Terrence, and FBI victim specialists, became the emotional centerpiece of the entire case. Victoria, still physically weak but composed, spoke directly to Marcus first. "You were right to recognize me," she said, her voice steady, despite the tears tracking down her face. "Not because I'm your mother, but because I was there the day they took you from your real mother. I was part of the process that stole you from your family and caused you both such pain." She turned to Shanice. "There is nothing I can say that will undo what we did to you, to hundreds of women like you. I participated in a system that decided your love for your child was worth less than someone else's, simply because of your race and economic status. I cannot ask for forgiveness, but I want you to know that I will spend whatever freedom I have left working to find every child we took and helping them return to their families." Shanice, who had prepared herself for this moment for days, responded with a dignity that moved everyone present. "I don't hate you," she said simply. "Hate would take energy I need for loving my son and healing our family. What I want is for you to help make sure this never happens to another mother, another child. That's the only thing that matters now." It was Marcus who asked the question that had been central to the case from the beginning. "Why did you look so scared when I pointed at you in court? If you knew I wasn't your son," Victoria's composure finally broke. "Because you're exactly the age my son would be now, if he had lived. The son my father took from me when I was 19, just as we took you from your mother. When you called me out, it felt like my past coming back to judge me. And you were right to judge me, Marcus. What we did was unforgivable. As the meeting concluded, Marcus did something no one expected. He reached out and briefly took Victoria's hand. "My mama says hate takes too much energy," he said, wisdom, beyond his years evident in his clear gaze. "I don't hate you either. I just want to be with my real mama now." It was a moment of grace that no one in that room would ever forget, a child showing more humanity than the adults who had failed him so profoundly. The next day, indictments were unsealed against 32 individuals connected to the Harrington network, including Richard Harrington, Senator James Prescott, and Victoria Harrington herself. The charges ranged from kidnapping and human trafficking to racketeering, fraud, conspiracy, and civil rights violations. Victoria, in accordance with her cooperation agreement, pled guilty to reduced charges in exchange for her testimony against the other defendants. Richard Harrington and Senator Prescott, along with the majority of those indicted, maintained their innocence and prepared for what promised to be one of the most significant criminal trials in Memphis history. As the legal process began its slow progression, the more immediate work of identifying and supporting victims continued with increasing urgency. For every Marcus Johnson who had somehow found his way back to his birth family, hundreds of other children remained unaware of their true origins, living with families who had acquired them through fraud and exploitation. The task of addressing this massive injustice had only just begun, but for the first time there was hope that truth and some measure of healing might finally be possible for communities that had suffered in silence for far too long. 6 months after Richard Harrington's dramatic airport arrest, Memphis had changed in ways both visible and subtle. The imposing Harrington Foundation building downtown now housed a community advocacy center, its assets frozen, and eventually redirected to support victims of the trafficking network. The family name had been removed from parks, hospitals, and university buildings across the city, a physical erasure of what had once seemed an untouchable legacy of wealth and influence. On a warm September morning, in a modest home in South Memphis, decorated with balloons and streamers, Shanice Johnson watched her son blow out 10 candles on a birthday cake, his first celebration surrounded by his true family. Marcus had thrived in the months since returning to his mother, though the journey had not been without challenges. Nightmares sometimes still woke him, and certain situations triggered anxiety from his years in foster care. But with consistent therapy and the unwavering support of Shanice and their extended family, his recovery had progressed remarkably. Most striking was his emergence from the withdrawn, guarded child who had stood in Judge Harrington's courtroom into a boy whose laugh came easily and whose natural intelligence flourished in a household that celebrated rather than suppressed his identity. The formal adoption ceremony had taken place 2 weeks earlier, a legal formality that acknowledged what Shanice had always known in her heart: Marcus was her son regardless of the 7 years stolen from them. The judge who finalized the adoption, an older black woman who had come out of retirement specifically to handle cases resulting from the Harrington investigation, had tears in her eyes as she signed the papers, making official what should never have been in question. Across town, Victoria Harrington sat in a federal courtroom for her sentencing hearing. Having pled guilty to reduced charges in exchange for her cooperation, she faced the possibility of 8 to 12 years in prison. Her testimony had been instrumental in building cases against all major participants in the conspiracy, particularly her father and husband. As part of her plea agreement, she had established a foundation funded by her personal assets, dedicated to locating and supporting all victims of the trafficking network. The judge, a federal appointee brought in from another district to ensure impartiality, acknowledged Victoria's cooperation while emphasizing the severity of her crimes. "Miss Prentice Harrington, your assistance to investigators has been substantial and appears genuinely motivated by remorse," he stated. "However, this court cannot overlook your central role in an operation that devastated hundreds of families over many years. The racial targeting of vulnerable communities adds a particularly reprehensible dimension to these crimes." Victoria was sentenced to 10 years in federal prison with eligibility for parole after serving 6 years. As she was led from the courtroom, Her expression revealed neither surprise nor protest, only a quiet acceptance of consequences that, however severe, could never truly balance the harm she had participated in creating. Richard Harrington and Senator James Prescott had not accepted their culpability so readily. Both men had hired elite defense teams and mounted aggressive challenges to every aspect of the prosecution's case. Richard's defense strategy focused on his age and declining health, seeking sympathy while arguing that any improprieties in his business operations had been the work of subordinates acting without his knowledge. Prescott positioned himself as an unwitting spouse, claiming complete ignorance of both his wife's activities and his father-in-law's business practices. Neither strategy proved effective against the mountain of evidence Victoria and other cooperating witnesses had provided. Their trial, which had captivated national media for 11 weeks, concluded with guilty verdicts on all major counts. Richard Harrington, at 73, received multiple life sentences, effectively ensuring he would spend his remaining years in federal prison. Senator Prescott received 25 years without possibility of early parole, his political career destroyed along with his freedom. Beyond these high-profile cases, the investigation had resulted in convictions for 28 other individuals, including doctors, hospital administrators, family court judges, and social workers who had facilitated the trafficking network. The systemic nature of the conspiracy had been laid bare, revealing how racism and profit had corrupted multiple institutions supposedly dedicated to child welfare. Terrence Washington's role in exposing the conspiracy had transformed his career trajectory. After leaving the public defender's office, he had been recruited to join the Justice Department's newly formed Civil Rights Enforcement Division, focusing specifically on systemic discrimination in family courts and child welfare systems. His first major initiative involved developing new protocols for family court cases involving minority children with enhanced oversight and documentation requirements designed to prevent the kind of abuses the Harrington Network had perpetrated. Diana Reynolds had similarly found her professional path altered by her involvement in Marcus's case. She now headed a specialized unit within Child Protective Services, training social workers to recognize and counteract racial bias in their assessments and decisions. The unit also focused on family preservation and support services in historically underserved communities, working to address the conditions that had made families vulnerable to predatory systems in the first place. The broader impact of the case extended well beyond Memphis. Federal investigations had been launched in 6 other cities where evidence suggested similar operations might exist. Nationwide audits of private adoption agencies, particularly those specializing in special needs or difficult placements, were underway. And most significantly, legislation had been introduced in Congress to reform adoption and foster care systems with specific provisions addressing racial disparities and enhancing protections for vulnerable families. Perhaps the most profound legacy, however, was the ongoing work of identifying and supporting the hundreds of children who had passed through the Harrington Network. A dedicated task force combining federal resources with nonprofit expertise had thus far located over 300 children ranging in age from 3 to 17. The process of addressing their situations required extraordinary sensitivity, balancing the rights of biological families against the psychological well-being of children who, in many cases, had no memory of their origins. For older children and teenagers who had spent most of their lives with their adoptive families, the revelation of their true origins often triggered identity crises and complex emotions. For younger children, questions of potential reunification with biological families raised difficult, legal, and ethical questions. Each case required individual assessment with the child's best interest as the guiding principle. Some families opted for open arrangements, allowing biological parents to establish relationships with children while maintaining their current living situations. Others chose complete reunification, beginning the challenging process of rebuilding connections severed years earlier. In all cases, comprehensive psychological support was provided, funded by assets seized from the Harrington enterprise and subsequent civil judgments against participating institutions. 6 months after his sentencing, Marcus Johnson had one final meeting with Victoria Harrington. The encounter, arranged at Victoria's request and carefully supervised, took place in the visitor's room of the Federal Correctional Facility where she was serving her sentence. Victoria, her blonde hair now streaked with gray, her prison uniform a stark contrast to her former judicial robes, sat across from Marcus with Shanice present at his side. "I wanted to explain something to you," Victoria said after the initial awkward greetings. "About why you thought I was your mother that day in court." She explained about her own lost child, the son, taken from her at 19 by her father's machinations, and the startling resemblance Marcus bore to what she imagined her own son would have looked like at 10. "When you pointed at me, called me out, it felt like the ghost of my past rising up to demand justice," she said softly. "And in a way, that's exactly what you were. Not my son, but a child who represented all the children I helped steal from their mothers, just as my father stole my child from me." She described how she had tried to save Marcus and his mother years earlier, making a rare attempt to sabotage one of the acquisitions by warning Shanice, only to be discovered and removed from direct involvement with the hospital operations. Afterward, "It doesn't excuse anything I did," Victoria concluded. "But I want you both to know that seeing you that day in court, Marcus broke something open in me that had been dead for 20 years. You made it impossible for me to keep living the lie." Marcus listened with the solemn attention that had become characteristic of him, a child forced to develop wisdom beyond his years. When Victoria finished speaking, he asked the question that had clearly been on his mind. "Do you think the other kids will find their real families too? Like I found my mama." Victoria's eyes filled with tears. "We're doing everything possible to make that happen," she said. "The records I kept, the evidence I provided, it's all being used to trace every child. It will take time, but I promise you, Marcus, finding those children and helping them understand their true histories is now the only purpose of my life." As the meeting concluded, Marcus did something that surprised both women. He extended his hand formally across the table to Victoria. "I forgive you," he said simply. The gesture from a child who had endured so much suffering because of her actions broke through Victoria's composure completely. Shanice placed her arm around her son's shoulders, her expression conveying a complex mixture of pride, love, and her own journey toward a healing that would never be complete but remained possible. In the months that followed, Marcus and Shanice established a new normal in their reunited lives. Marcus entered a school program for gifted students, his academic potential finally recognized and nurtured. Shanice completed her nursing assistant certification, securing stable employment with benefits for the first time in her adult life. Most significantly, Marcus started a peer support group for other children recovered from the Harrington network, creating a safe space for them to process their complicated emotions and experiences. The group, which began with just 5 children meeting in a community center classroom, quickly grew to over 30 regular participants, with Marcus emerging as a natural leader despite being younger than many attendees. His journey from victim to advocate embodied the resilience that would be necessary for hundreds of families to heal from the wounds inflicted by years of systematic exploitation. On a crisp autumn afternoon, 1 year after Marcus had pointed at Judge Victoria Harrington in a Memphis courtroom and said those 5 words that cracked open a conspiracy spanning decades, he stood before a different audience. At a community healing ceremony organized by families affected by the Harrington network, he spoke briefly but powerfully about his experience. "They thought we wouldn't remember," he said, his voice clear and steady. "They thought we were too little, or that we'd believe the lies they told us about our real families. But the truth was always inside us, waiting to come out." He looked around at the gathering, a diverse group, united by shared trauma, but also by the determination to reclaim their narratives and rebuild their families. "Now we get to tell our own stories," Marcus concluded. "And nobody can ever take that away from us again." As the ceremony ended, Shanice embraced her son, both of them surrounded by a community that had transformed from victims into advocates, their collective voice ensuring that the system that had failed them so profoundly would never again operate unchallenged. The path to full healing remained long and complex, but for the first time it was illuminated by truth, justice, and the unbreakable bonds of families who had refused to be permanently severed by even the most powerful forces of corruption and racism. What would you do if you were in Marcus's shoes? Could you find the strength to forgive those who caused such deep harm to your family? Comment below with your thoughts, and like this video if you believe in the power of truth to overcome even the most entrenched injustice. Subscribe to hear more stories of courage and resilience that change the world. Thank you for joining me for this powerful journey through darkness into light, and remember that sometimes the smallest voice speaking truth can bring down the mightiest systems of corruption. Stay strong, stay compassionate, and I'll see you in the next story. This story reveals how systems of power can become corrupted when wealth and privilege intersect with racial prejudice. The Harrington network exploited vulnerable Black and Hispanic families, turning children into commodities, while disguising their actions as philanthropy. It demonstrates how racism can become institutionalized across multiple systems: healthcare, courts, child welfare, creating seemingly insurmountable barriers for marginalized communities seeking justice. Marcus's courage teaches us that even the most powerful conspiracies can be broken by a single voice speaking truth. His recognition of Judge Harrington in that courtroom was the first crack in a system designed to silence people like him and his mother. This illustrates how those who perpetuate injustice rely on silence and invisibility to maintain their power. The story also highlights the resilience of family bonds. Despite 7 years of separation and systematic attempts to erase his origins, Marcus maintained an innate connection to his true identity and family. Shanice's unwavering belief that her son was alive demonstrates the profound intuition of maternal love. Perhaps most importantly, the story shows that healing and justice require both accountability and compassion. Real change came not just through punishment of the perpetrators, but through rebuilding systems, supporting victims, and creating spaces for healing. Marcus's journey from victim to advocate embodies the transformative power of turning personal trauma into collective action for justice. What would you do if faced with a corrupt system that seemed too powerful to challenge? Would you find the courage to speak up like Marcus, or support someone who did? Comment below with how you think we can better protect vulnerable families from exploitation and discrimination in our communities today. If this story moved you, please hit that like button to help others discover it too. Subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories about resilience in the face of injustice, and share this video with someone who needs to understand how systemic racism continues to impact families. Thank you for listening with an open heart to Marcus and Shanice's journey. Remember that in our darkest moments, speaking truth to power can create ripples of change that transform entire communities. Stay compassionate, stay vigilant, and I'll see you in the next story.